All right, let's dive into the world of Jiddu Krishnamurti, a pretty major 20th century thinker. We've got a bunch of excerpts from his books to work with here, and we're going to try to pull out the really core ideas of his worldview.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Get ready to unpack some seriously thought-provoking concepts. We'll be talking about thought itself, freedom, and even self-knowledge.
Big topics.
Oh, yeah. We've got an expert with us today who's, well, kind of a master at breaking down these complex philosophical ideas.
What's at my best?
Now, I was prepping for our deep dive into Krishnamurti. There was this one concept that just totally grabbed me.
Oh.
The idea that it's not just clock time, but actually psychological time. The way we experience time in our heads,
Yep.
that's actually at the root of human suffering.
Interesting.
That maybe, just maybe, it's possible to live without that me that's so tied to time.
You think that's possible?
Not sure. I mean, does that sound as wild to you as it does to me?
It's a powerful concept, that's for sure.
Right.
And yeah, one that really challenges the way we normally think about ourselves and, well, everything around us, really.
Absolutely. So where do we even start with a thinker like Krishnamurti? I mean, his work is so rich and layered.
Well, you'll find this idea of conditioning pops up again and again in his writing.
Oh, yeah, he talks about that a lot.
He really wants us to grasp how deeply our thoughts, our beliefs, even our actions are shaped by all sorts of things.
Like what?
Past experiences, definitely, but also cultural influences, societal structures, things we often don't even realize are shaping us.
It's like we're puppets and don't even see the strings.
Kinda, yeah.
There's that anecdote he uses, remember, about young people
Yeah, I remember that.
wanting to create a new world, to break from the past.
But ending up just repeating the same old patterns.
Right. Even rebellion, he suggests, can be a form of conditioning. I thought that was really insightful.
Definitely. It's like, even when we think we're breaking free, we might just be acting out another version of the same script.
Wow. Okay, so how do we even begin to see these strings, these patterns that are shaping us?
Well, it starts with awareness, I think.
Okay, awareness. So just noticing those patterns.
Right. Paying attention to how our thoughts, our reactions, even our desires might be influenced by our past experiences, by the culture we're immersed in.
I mean, does that mean that we're all just stuck in these, mental prisons?
In a sense, yeah, maybe. But Krishnamurti isn't saying we're doomed or anything.
Okay, good.
He's saying that by becoming aware of these patterns, by seeing them clearly, that's when we can start to free ourselves.
So awareness is like the key.
I think so, yeah. And, that awareness leads us to another key concept, the illusion of the self.
Right, that we tend to cling to so tightly.
Exactly. Krishnamurti suggests that this me, the self, isn't actually some solid, unchanging entity.
It's not.
Nope. More like a fluid, ever-changing construct.
A construct of what?
Well, of thought and time, mostly.
So our sense of self is just made up.
In a way, yes.
I mean, how so?
We piece together this idea of self from memories, desires, fears, all that.
Okay, I can see that.
And then we mistake it for something real and permanent when it's actually not.
It's like we think it's a solid building, but it's actually more like a tent.
Yeah, a tent that's constantly changing shape in the wind.
That's a great way to put it.
And Krishnamurti would argue that as long as we're clinging to this idea of self, this me, as long as we're identifying with it so strongly, we're going to keep experiencing suffering.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right, because that me is always going to be lacking something, always wanting more, always comparing itself to others.
And never quite measuring up.
Exactly. There's this powerful passage where Krishnamurti asks, is it possible to live a life in which there is no comparison at all and yet not be satisfied?
What do you think he's getting at there?
I think he's challenging us to look at this deep-seated need we have to measure ourselves against everyone else.
You mean constantly checking if we're good enough, smart enough, successful enough?
Yeah, all of that. And he's suggesting that this constant comparison is exactly what keeps us trapped in that cycle of dissatisfaction and suffering. It's like we're always looking outside ourselves for validation instead of just accepting ourselves as we are.
Okay, I can definitely relate to that.
Right.
I mean, I think we've all felt that, never quite measuring up, always wanting more.
And Krishnamurti would say that this dissatisfaction comes from this illusion of the self, this idea that we're all separate individuals competing with each other for, limited resources.
We're not.
Not really.
So what is he suggesting then?
To see through this illusion, to recognize that we're all fundamentally interconnected, that we're part of something much larger than ourselves.
So if we let go of this idea of the separate self, if we can see through that illusion, then we can find true satisfaction and freedom.
That's the potential he's pointing to, and it's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot either.
That wouldn't be much fun.
No, definitely not. It's about recognizing that true joy, true fulfillment comes from something deeper than our ego desires and fears.
Okay, this is all really thought-provoking.
It is, isn't it?
So we've talked about conditioning and the illusion of the self.
Right.
But there's this other big concept I want to dig into.
What's that?
The nature of thought itself.
Ah, yes. That's a fascinating one.
Right. I mean, Krishnamurti has this very particular perspective on thought.
He does.
On the one hand, he acknowledges that, okay, thinking is essential. It's how we navigate the world, solve problems, create things.
Right. We need thought to function.
Exactly. But then he warns us that thought can also be this major source of suffering.
That's the paradox.
So how is thought a source of suffering?
Well, he points out that much of our thinking is really just rehashing the past.
Like a broken record.
Kind of, yeah. A mental rut that keeps us stuck in these old patterns. We rely on knowledge, memories, fixed ideas.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, it prevents us from seeing things fresh, from experiencing the world with a sense of openness and wonder, like we're looking through dirty glasses.
Okay. He even goes as far as saying that knowledge can be dangerous when it's used for, self-centered activity. I remember that part.
Exactly. Think about all the times you've used knowledge to, I don't know, prove yourself right or win an argument or even manipulate someone.
Oh, yeah. Guilty as charged.
Krishnamurti would say that kind of knowledge is actually ignorance.
Really?
Because it's rooted in fear, ego, the desire to maintain a sense of separation.
So it's not about rejecting knowledge altogether,
No, not at all.
but about using it wisely.
Yes, with a sense of humility and awareness.
So how do we do that? How do we know when we're using knowledge for good or for bad?
That's where Krishnamurti introduces this idea, insight. He contrasts thought, which he sees as mechanical and limited,
Okay, thought is mechanical and limited.
with insight, which is a different kind of perception altogether, one that goes beyond thought and conditioning.
So insight is a deeper understanding that comes from somewhere else.
You could say that. It's a flash of understanding, like directly seeing into the nature of things. And you can't get there through analysis or effort.
Oh, so it's not something you can force.
Not at all. More like a sudden shift in perspective, a moment of clarity that arises when the mind is quiet and receptive.
You know, that reminds me of that passage where Krishnamurti talks about needing a mind that's very quiet, extraordinarily subtle, pliable, quick, sensitive,
I remember that one.
and free from the known, but still able to function in the world.
It's like he's describing this balance.
Yeah, a balance between being grounded in reality and being open to something beyond our usual way of thinking.
Exactly. He's highlighting this paradox. We can't escape the realm of thought, but we also can't let it completely rule us.
That's a tough one. So how do we even begin to find that balance?
How do we cultivate that quiet, subtle, pliable mind he talks about? Well, that's where Krishnamurti's emphasis on self-knowledge and awareness comes in.
Okay, so more self-awareness. How do we get better at that?
He suggests that by just paying attention to our thoughts, observing our minds without judgment, we start to create space for insight to emerge.
So, not trying to force our minds to be quiet, but creating the conditions for stillness to happen naturally.
Exactly. And that stillness isn't about becoming passive or withdrawn. It's about being fully present, fully engaged with life, but from a place of clarity and understanding.
I like that. It's like the stillness of a deep lake that reflects the sky perfectly because there are no ripples or waves disturbing the surface.
That's beautiful.
It really captures what Krishnamurti's talking about.
He's suggesting that true peace and freedom aren't found by escaping from the world. They're found by seeing the world clearly, by understanding the nature of our own minds.
Okay, so understanding leads to peace and freedom.
That's what he's saying. And that understanding, that insight, is what allows us to respond to life differently, with wisdom and compassion.
This is also thought-provoking. We've covered a lot of ground, even just talking about conditioning, self, and thought.
We have.
But I'm really interested in exploring how all of this connects to the possibility of ending suffering. which I know is like a central theme in Krishnamurti's work.
It definitely is. Perhaps we can give our listener a moment to reflect on these ideas before we dive into that.
Yeah, good idea. We'll be back in a moment to continue exploring Krishnamurti's profound and, dare I say, radical philosophy. As we've been talking about these ideas about conditioning, about this illusion of the self, I've been kind of struck by how much they actually show up in my own life.
Really?
Yeah, it's like I'm suddenly starting to see the strings behind the puppet show.
That's a great analogy. Krishnamurti would say that we're often just totally unaware of how our thoughts and actions are being shaped by forces that are totally outside of our conscious control.
Right. It's freaky when you start to realize it.
Yeah, but he'd also say that by bringing awareness to those forces, by shining a light on them, that's when we can start to loosen their grip.
So it's not about trying to force ourselves to be different,
Yeah.
more about understanding how we've already become what we are.
Exactly. It's about seeing ourselves clearly without judgment. And that's where his idea of choiceless awareness comes in.
I've heard him talk about that, yeah.
It's like observing a tree without any judgment or preference, just seeing it for what it is. You can apply that same kind of awareness to yourself, to your own thoughts, feelings, the whole shebang.
Instead of trying to change ourselves, we're just observing what's going on inside.
Right. You're not getting caught up in the story.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's about developing this capacity for self-observation, for seeing ourselves as we truly are, without the filters, without all the judgment.
So radical honesty.
Yes, and it's not always easy. I mean, we tend to have all these defenses and rationalizations that keep us from being truly honest with ourselves.
Oh yeah, I know, I do that all the time.
We all do it.
Like when I pretend to be way more patient than I actually am, or when I tell myself that something doesn't bother me, when deep down, it totally does.
It's human nature. But Krishnamurti would say that all this self-deception, it just keeps us stuck in our suffering. True freedom, he says, comes from seeing ourselves honestly, warts and all.
Okay, so we cultivate this choiceless awareness, this radical honesty with ourselves. Then what? What does freedom actually look like, according to Krishnamurti? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear the word freedom, they think about being able to do whatever they want, no rules.
Right, but Krishnamurti's idea of freedom is way deeper than that.
It is.
It's not about indulging your every whim or impulse. It's freedom from the tyranny of the self, from the constant chatter of the mind, from all that conditioning we were talking about earlier, the stuff that keeps us stuck.
It's almost like waking up from a dream.
Yeah, it is kind of like that.
I remember a quote where he talks about the need for an extraordinarily subtle, pliable, quick, sensitive mind that's free from what he calls the known. It's like he's describing a mind that's awake, present, responding to life directly, not through all those filters of past conditioning.
You got it. And this awakening, this shift in consciousness, it's not something you can force, It's not like, oh, I'm going to try really hard to be awakened today.
So how does it happen?
It happens when we see the truth of what is, when we understand the limits of our usual ways of thinking. It's kind of like suddenly realizing you've been wearing glasses with the wrong prescription your whole life.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
So we're walking around all blurry, and then suddenly, bam, everything's clear.
That's a great way to put it. And Krishnamurti would say that clarity, that freedom, it's available to everyone.
Really?
Everyone.
Yeah, it's not like something you have to earn or be worthy of or anything.
It's just there.
It's our birthright, he says.
Wow. Okay, but how do we actually access it? Like, what are the steps? What do we do? Well, Krishnamurti was pretty clear that there's no one-size-fits-all answer here. There's no magic formula, no secret technique. It's not about joining a group or anything.
Didn't he even dissolve that Order of the Star in the East?
He did.
The group that had formed around him.
Yep. He didn't want to be seen as some kind of guru, some authority figure.
So he was really serious about this whole find your own way thing.
Totally. He consistently pointed back to self-knowledge, becoming aware of our own patterns. He talks about choiceless awareness, again, a way of just observing ourselves without judging, just seeing what is.
And that kind of awareness, it's not something you can force, right?
Right. Forcing it would just be another form of control, another way of trying to manipulate our experience. He said that to really observe, to truly listen, the mind has to be quiet.
Okay, so quiet mind.
Yeah.
But how do we do that? Our minds are never quiet.
Well, that's where meditation comes in, but not the kind of meditation where you're trying to empty your mind.
Oh, good, because I'm terrible at that.
Krishnamurti saw meditation more as a way of being, a quality of attention that we bring to our whole life.
So it's not about sitting on a cushion and chanting Om.
Not necessarily. It's about bringing that same quality of awareness to everything you do. Washing dishes, having a conversation, dealing with a difficult situation.
So mindfulness,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, you could say that. It's about integrating this awareness into everyday life. And honestly, it's not easy. It takes commitment. It takes discipline to break those patterns that we're so used to.
He even says somewhere that it can take like 1,000 years to free ourselves from what he calls the known. It's like a lifelong process.
He wasn't being literal about the 1,000 years. But the point is, this isn't some quick fix. It's a profound shift in consciousness. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes a willingness to, well, to really confront ourselves.
Honestly, that sounds kind of scary,
It can be.
but also exciting.
Definitely. It's about questioning everything. All the beliefs, assumptions, values that we've always taken for granted. It's like he's saying, let go of all the safety nets, all the crutches you're using to hold yourself up and see what happens.
And what does happen?
He suggests that what happens is we discover a strength, a resilience that we didn't even know we had. We find a capacity for love, compassion, intelligence that's way bigger than anything we could imagine.
Okay, that's inspiring, but how do we even begin to put all of this into practice? Like, where do we start?
Well, Krishnamurti always came back to this idea of awareness. He said to start by noticing the patterns that are shaping your thoughts, feelings, and actions. Just observe.
We talked about that before, but how do we actually do that?
He suggests we pay attention to our thoughts, feelings, reactions without judgment. Just noticing what's happening inside, observing our habits, seeing how our minds work.
So, like, creating a kind of inner witness.
Yes, exactly. A part of ourselves that can just observe without getting swept up in all the drama. That's what he means by choiceless awareness.
Sounds tough.
It is. Our minds are busy places. It takes practice to cultivate that kind of detached observation. But he believed it was essential for real change to happen.
Okay, so we're paying attention. Then what? What do we do with all that information?
He believed that the very act of observation, of bringing awareness to those patterns, can start to loosen their grip on us. It's like shining a light into a dark room. The darkness doesn't disappear right away, but it can't hide anymore.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So awareness is the first step toward freedom.
It is, yeah. It's the key. But it's not a one-time thing. It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
There will be times when you fall back into old patterns, when you get caught up in the drama.
So what do we do when that happens?
You just notice it
Um,
without judgment. You say, okay, I see what's happening here. I'm hooked. And you gently bring your attention back to the present moment.
It's like training a puppy.
Exactly. It takes patience and persistence, but it's so worth it.
What about love and intelligence? I know Krishnamurti talks about those a lot. How do they fit in with all of this?
That's a great question, and it gets to the core of what he's all about. He says love and intelligence aren't things you acquire through effort or learning. They're not products of thought.
So where do they come from?
They're inherent qualities, he says, that emerge when the mind is free from conditioning, from the illusion of the self.
So they're already there, but they're blocked by all the mental clutter.
Exactly. There's a line where he says, it seems to me that one thing is absolutely necessary, and that is passion without motive.
I remember that one.
It's like he's describing this pure, unconditioned energy that just flows when the mind is quiet.
That sounds amazing.
It is. He's talking about a state of being that's not based on desire, on seeking, on trying to achieve something. It's about openness, vulnerability, radical acceptance. And that's when love and intelligence can just naturally flow.
It's like tapping into a source of energy and creativity that we didn't even know existed.
That's it. And this energy, this creativity, it can transform our lives, but also the world around us.
So this isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. It has real-world implications.
Absolutely. Krishnamurti was deeply concerned with what was happening in the world, all the violence, greed, corruption. And he believed that all these problems came down to the way we think, the way we see ourselves and the world.
He saw the outer chaos as a reflection of the inner chaos.
Exactly. And he believed that if we could transform ourselves, if we could free ourselves from the conditioning that keeps us stuck in those destructive patterns, that's when we could create a more peaceful and just world.
So he wasn't advocating for just withdrawing from the world.
No, not at all. He said we need to engage, but from a place of freedom and understanding. True transformation begins with inner understanding.
It's not about changing the world out there. It's about changing the world in here.
Exactly. And he wasn't naive about how difficult this is. He knew it was a radical idea, a challenging path, but he saw it as the only real hope.
The only hope for what?
For a more peaceful and just world, he would say, look, We've tried everything else. Wars, revolutions, political reforms. And the fundamental problems of human suffering, they're still there. We're just repeating the same patterns,
Mm.
making the same mistakes because we haven't addressed the root
And
cause.
the root causes.
The way we think, the way we perceive ourselves and the world, this illusion of the separate self, the clinging to beliefs and ideologies, the constant striving for security and pleasure.
So are you saying we have to, like, abandon all of our beliefs and desires to be free?
He wasn't saying we should force ourselves to be different. He was saying that when we see the truth of our situation, when we understand how our thoughts and desires are creating suffering, something naturally begins to shift inside us.
Like an awakening. A new way of seeing things.
That's it. And that awakening, you can't force it. It comes when you're ready.
Like a flower blooming. You can't force it, but you can create the conditions for it to happen naturally.
Exactly. And that's what Krishnamurti is talking about. We can't force ourselves to be free, but we can create the conditions for freedom to emerge. And those conditions are self-knowledge, choiceless awareness, and a willingness to question everything.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. I think we should probably pause here and give our listener a chance to digest all this. We'll be back in a moment to continue exploring this radical and transformative vision. You know, diving into Krishnamurti's world like this has made one thing really clear to me.
What's that?
This guy really wants us to think differently about, well, everything, pretty much. It's like he's turning everything upside down.
Yeah, he definitely challenges a lot of our usual assumptions, especially this idea of looking inward for answers instead of outward.
Right, like stop looking for gurus, stop looking for external authorities, look inside yourself.
Exactly. Remember what he said, if you find a guru, run away. He didn't want to be seen as one himself. He was adamant about that.
So you're saying that real change, real freedom, it has to come from within, not from following someone else's path, not from some external source?
Exactly. Krishnamurti believed that we all have this incredible capacity within us, this capacity to awaken to our own wisdom, to that potential for freedom and love that's already there.
Okay, but how do we actually tap into that? I mean,
Yeah.
it can feel pretty elusive sometimes.
He uses the example of a scientist observing the world. A true scientist approaches their work with curiosity, right? Open to what the data shows them, willing to let go of their preconceived ideas.
Right.
He says we can approach our own lives that way too.
Become scientists of our own experience.
Yeah. Just observe your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors without judging them, without condemning yourself. Just see what's there.
So it's about being more mindful, more aware.
Exactly. It's about developing that capacity for self-reflection, being able to step back from our thoughts and feelings so we can see them more objectively.
That's harder than it sounds, though, isn't it?
It is. Our minds are usually pretty busy. They're constantly creating stories, coming up with justifications for why we do the things we do.
It's like our minds are trying to protect us, even if it means keeping us trapped.
That's why Krishnamurti emphasizes questioning everything, being willing to challenge our assumptions and beliefs. Don't take things at face value. Look for yourself. See what's actually true.
I always found it amazing that he even encouraged us to question his own teachings. That's pretty radical for a spiritual teacher.
It is. It shows he wasn't interested in creating followers. He wanted us to think for ourselves, to find our own way.
No dogma.
Exactly. No dogma. And that's what makes his teaching so empowering. He's giving us tools, not rules. He's saying, hey, here's how to look, how to observe, how to question. But ultimately, it's up to us to do the work.
It's like he's giving us a map, but not telling us where to go. He's
Yeah.
trusting us to find our own way.
Exactly. To create our own path.
And that can be a little scary, right?
It can. It means stepping outside our comfort zones, letting go of certainty, embracing the unknown.
It's like he's inviting us on an adventure, a journey into ourselves, and the destination. Freedom. Freedom from suffering, freedom from fear, freedom from all the limitations we put on ourselves.
And that freedom, it's available to all of us.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who you are, what you believe, or what your life circumstances are. It's a freedom that comes from understanding, from insight, from a shift in consciousness.
Okay, so this freedom isn't just about, like, personal happiness.
Yeah.
It sounds like it has implications for how we interact with the world, how we treat each other, how we participate in social change.
You got it. Krishnamurti believed that when we're free from that tyranny of self, when fear and desire aren't running the show, our actions naturally become more compassionate, more intelligent.
There's that quote I love where he says, "A mind that is free from violence can never create violence." So real peace has to start within each individual.
It makes sense, right? If we're at war with ourselves, if we're full of anger and resentment, that's going to spill out into our relationships, into our communities, into the world.
He talks about how quick we are to blame others, to point fingers, to look for someone else to fix things.
Right, it's always someone else's fault.
But Krishnamurti says, nope, real change starts with us, with our own willingness to look inside and see how we're contributing to the problems we see.
It's a tough message. It's much easier to focus on changing the world out there than to confront our own shadows, our own blind spots.
It's like he's saying, don't wait for someone else to fix the world. Start with yourself. Be the change you want to see.
Exactly. That's what makes Krishnamurti's teaching so radical, so relevant. He's not offering us beliefs or a political program. He's offering us a way of being in the world, a way that's transformative and liberating.
He's inviting us to step into our full potential, to create a world that's more just, more compassionate, more in alignment with who we truly are.
Beautifully put.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of Krishnamurti's thought, but it's definitely given me and hopefully our listener a lot to think about.
I agree. His work is like a bottomless well. The more you explore it, the deeper it gets.
So if you're feeling inspired, I encourage you to check out some of his books, maybe listen to some of his talks. We'll have links to some resources on our website.
That's a great idea.
In the meantime, maybe take a few moments to just sit quietly, observe your breath, note what's happening inside.
Remember, this journey of self-discovery, it's a lifelong process. Be patient with yourself, be curious, and be open to the incredible possibilities that are within you.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Jiddu Krishnamurti. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep waking up.